Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. It's been almost axiomatic to say that so many of the problems that plague men in our society today stem from changes in economics, that technology, globalization, education, or lack thereof are all at the core of the problem. Yet regardless of who we give credit to, unemployment is at the lowest it's been in 50 years. American manufacturing is relatively strong. Sure, things have changed with respect to jobs and the economy and pay, but clearly other forces are at play for the men of America. The result is not just the Me Too movement, but a fundamental redefinition of the idea of masculinity. Oftentimes, pop culture gives us insight into the human condition. As we watch the rise and fall and transformation of Don Draper and Tony Soprano tried to get in touch with his feelings, perhaps we saw precursors of what's happening in America today. The problem is that the cost to the country and to our communities is very high. We're going to talk about this with my guest, Andrew Yarrow. He's a senior fellow at the Progressive Policy Institute. He's been a New York Times reporter, a Labor Department speechwriter, and a U.S. history professor at American University. He's been affiliated with Brookings and the Aspen Institute, and he writes frequently for the national media. It is my pleasure to welcome Andrew Yarrow here to talk about his new book, Man Out, Men on the Sidelines of American Life. Andrew Yarrow, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great to have you here. One of the things that's important, I think, to understand, and you talk about this in Man Out, is that it's too easy when we think about the problems that men are facing today to sort of look at it just in political terms, that this isn't a problem just of the culture or a problem just of the economy, that it's somehow more complex than that.
That's right. I argue in the book that there's a interplay between culture and economics and with a number of different variables at play, ranging from the health of men, men's attitudes toward women, issues and problems with fatherhood, men at work or not at work, and other issues. So I also argue, too, that and discuss in the book that while so much attention has been paid to the white working class, that a significant part of the Trump political base, and with the Kavanaugh hearings, these privileged prep school grads, that men who are struggling really encompass a lot of other groups, including men higher up the socioeconomic scale, over 50 or 55, formerly incarcerated men, and millennial men who are especially struggling. Actually, all of them are.
How much of this, in your view, is as a result of changes that have affected or that are internal in terms of coming from men, as opposed to it being reactive to the changes that have taken place for women since the early 90s?
Well, I think it's hard to separate the two. There have long been ideas of what masculinity should be in the U.S. and in the Western world. The traditional notion that many people call toxic masculinity, that a man should be tough, a man should never show emotions, a man should have as many sexual partners as possible. And at the same time, men are confronted with a very different, more progressive view of manhood, in part brought about by the feminist movement. And it's left many men confused, unsure of what role they should play.
In your view, why has that happened? What was the missing element that created that insecurity and that confusion for men?
Well, I think there are a lot of things at play. It was striking that, the several hundred men I interviewed for this book, I often heard the comment that, feminism has done a lot of good for women, but what has it done for men? Or it's left us kind of confused. And as you mentioned at the outset, I mean, there are economic issues that are very real. Despite the low official unemployment rate, the labor force participation rate is also very low. In other words, the number of adult men actually working the percentage is lower than it's really ever been, or it's near that low. So, you have 18% of men between 25 and 64 not working, and larger percentages if you go into the lower 20s and upper 60s.
You mentioned that this is happening in large areas of millennials. Talk about that, because I think that will come as a surprise to a lot of people.
Yeah, that's right. Millennial men are considerably more likely than millennial women to be living at home. I mean, we've all heard about the phenomenon of boomerang kids, or kids coming to sleep in their parents' basement and have their moms make them breakfast. But it's really a more gendered issue. Men are struggling much more with this. Millennial men are also less likely to work than men of their age in generations past. And some of this is an overhang of the Great Recession, that they kind of grew up at the wrong time. But there are also cultural factors affecting millennial men. I mean, this is a generation that grew up with online media, gaming, and there are an awful lot of hardcore male gamers. Some studies have suggested that some of the men who are young men who are not working are sort of substituting almost one for one the time with staying at home and gaming. So there are a lot of factors. I mean, I could talk too about drugs and alcohol and addiction. Men are twice as likely to overdose on heroin, opioids, and even this kind of ranges into all men, but it's a big issue for younger men. Suicide rates have been going up, and they're about 3.5 times the rate for women among men. So, I mean, a lot of factors here.
Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about education and the role that plays. We see more and more women, millennial women in particular, going to college. Talk a little bit about what's happening within the educational realm that is somehow fueling this.
Yes. No, that's an excellent point, Jeff. Over the years, the proportion of men in higher education has declined sharply, and the proportion of women naturally has risen to the point that today about 58% of college graduates are women. And in some of the classes I've taught at American University, it comes closer to 70% women. And there's also a lot of evidence that boys in K through 12 don't do as well academically, that they have more behavior problems. And some of this stems from other issues that many have decried, like the abolition of PE or the truncating of recess. There's sort of not a place for boys to go out and just get off that energy. And there's also some evidence that there may be some bias against boys in K through 12. As one study, a blind study, showed that teachers graded boys a bit higher when they didn't know their gender. So, but clearly boys and young men are not doing well in the educational field.
What's changed? Why is that the case? Or was a lot of this always lurking below the surface? And because of male privilege, because of male entitlement, because of patriarchy, even in K through 12, it didn't really begin to express itself until changes started to take place for women in the early 90s.
That's true. I think a lot of things were at play. I mean, the influence of feminism and in the broader culture, the acceptance of women in the workplace, the the sense that women could be just as good as, if not better, than men in colleges. And I think a lot of things brought us to this point. And, perhaps, well, not perhaps, but another big issue is the soaring cost of higher education. Well, on balance, you would think that would affect boys and girls, men and women, equally. But I think, a lot of young men feel that, they may start college, but they really are more likely to be floundering these days. So they're more likely to drop out. And, there's a big population of so-called NEETs, not in employment, education, and training, people between 16 and 24. And there are a lot of men in that population.
One of the other things you talk about is the impact that this is having on our communities and the country at large. Talk about that.
Sure. Well, there are many angles into that, and the issues of masculinity and toxic masculinity are one, which we certainly see in the Kavanaugh affair, and I can talk about a bit more. But something less focused on is the decline of male participation in civic groups and community life. Decades ago, you used to have groups like the Rotary, the Elks, etc., that drew, and labor unions for that matter, that drew together lots of men. And those institutions have all pretty much cratered, and as far as civic organizations, have only really stayed alive, many men told me, who are in Rotary, because courts forced the admission of women in the late 80s. And as one guy said to me, women do most of the work in our Rotary Club. So this kind of declining, sociability, participation, and organizations, it's worked for various causes for the public good, has been a factor.
Talk a little bit about the men that are not suffering, the ones that are successful today, and what we can learn from that.
Yeah, Jeff, that's a very interesting point. As I say in my book, most men are not struggling or not man out. I estimate that by various measures, probably 1 in 5 adult men, there are about 20 million adult men, fall into this category of men out, but that means that 4 out of 5 don't. And among those, some are doing okay, and some are doing spectacularly well. As you know, inequality has been increasing significantly over the last few decades in the U.S. And just looking at millennials again, there's an interesting stat that I found. In 1975, about 25% of people of millennial age, or men of millennial age, were below the poverty level, and today it's about 40% below the poverty level. But at the other end of the spectrum, in 1975, only about 2.7 or 2.9% of men, young men, were earning over the equivalent of today's $100,000. Whereas today you have close to 6% of men, a near doubling, sort of at the high end. And so in short, I mean, there are a lot of men doing extremely well. There are some men doing extremely well, a lot of men doing pretty decently, and then large minority who aren't.
Given that so many are doing well, why aren't there more of them that are serving as role models?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think one big piece of it is the extent to which this is a class-based issue. Even though, as I said, there are many people, many men higher up the socioeconomic spectrum who've quit jobs, been pushed out of jobs, aren't working, are lonely, their marriages may have fallen apart, but this huge number of men in rural America, small town America, are kind of invisible to those, the talking class, the political class, and similarly, another huge population that's kind of invisible are formerly incarcerated men. Because of mass incarceration in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, we have about at least 17 million men who were once in prison. And for them, jobs are hard to find. It's hard to reconnect with family if there is family, and it's hard to make new friends or other connections. So many of the people who are struggling are not even visible.
Is this resulting in a kind of anger that also has consequences?
Oh, absolutely. We certainly see it with the bitter debate over the Kavanaugh hearing nomination. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of misogyny out there. The internet has particularly facilitated this, as we've seen again with Kavanaugh. And I don't want to dwell on that, but there are a lot of men who anonymously say pretty vile things, said to Dr. Ford, but have said to female journalists, have said to women in their lives, ex-wives, ex-girlfriends, others. There's revenge porn out there. There's sexting. So, there's a kind of roiling culture or subculture of men who are conveying a lot of pretty vile things. And then at the far extreme is this world known as the manosphere, where men believe that they're the ones who've been shafted, that they're the victims, and women have been the victimizers, and we, these men, need to get back at them, which is very sad.
And how is that playing itself out?
Well, it's playing itself out in a lot of ways. As I say, there's this rampant misogyny on the internet. You see this kind of anger in politics as well. Back in 1980, when Ronald Reagan was first elected, or just before that, men and women tended to vote pretty equally for the Democrats and Republicans. In 2016, there was a 24-point gender gap. So, as we go into this election cycle, we see a lot of angry men, and I think we're going to see a lot more polarization between many men and women, as many men feel that they've been shafted, and men would tell me that they're angry at employers and the economic system, they're angry at government, and they're angry at women, and they sort of blame their circumstances on all four.
As we look at all of the anger that exists about this, and you add it to all the other social and political and class divides that we have in the country today, Is this just another layer of division to all of that?
I think it is. And, I think it certainly intersects with a lot of other divisions, class divisions, clearly political divisions, geographical divisions. And it doesn't paint a pretty picture for the future unless there are really good and strong attempts to address some of these issues for men, but address many issues for men and women in an economy where wages have been stagnant for about the bottom 80% for many years.
Talk a little bit about what you have seen and what your reporting tells you with respect to the reactions of women to what's taking place with these men.
Yeah, that's a great question. And if it weren't so sad, some of the stories would be funny. I talked with a number of ex-wives who had very choice words to say about the former men in their lives, including some upper middle class professional women whose husbands had been professional. And, these guys maybe became disenchanted with their jobs and quit. Maybe they were downsized. Maybe these men thought that they would create the next big thing or write the next, the great American novel. And, a lot of these guys stopped working. And, for these women, they found their husbands increasingly retreating truly and metaphorically into the basement, where a number of them found their husbands, trolling on the internet late at night, drinking heavily, hooking up with women, looking at pornography, and, hence a lot of disdain for their ex-husbands. And then, in the whole dating world, there's kind of two attitudes among women, frustrated women. I mean, there are obviously many women and men who want good relationships, but there's some women who feel that, there just aren't enough good men out there, that either they have to trade down, so to speak, or they say they don't need men. And on the other hand, women find in a lot of cases on online dating sites that men are just out there trolling.
Talk a little bit about ways in which you see solutions to any of this. I mean, as you talk to people, men and women alike, where is the way out of any of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as I say in my book, we really need to approach these problems from both a policy point of view and from a cultural standpoint. In terms of policy, I think we need to do a lot more to create good jobs, provide more training opportunities, especially for kind of middle-skill jobs, which are the ones that have largely disappeared. With globalization, with automation, with robots, I think there need to be things like public works programs that could employ men. I think in terms of the civic piece and even the skills piece, there's a good case to be made for mandatory national service. I talked with a number of Army recruiters and basic training commanders who felt that, a lot of the men who wanted to get into the Army are just, not qualified. They're not smart enough. They're not physically fit. And so, and they supported national service, civilian as well as military, that, people, it would help a lot of guys as well as women to have this kind of opportunity to serve the country and see that there's something bigger beyond them. And then, one can go out down into the weeds of issues like tax policy, not to go on and on, but, the earned income tax credit is not applicable to non-custodial fathers. It's not applicable to men or open to men under 25. That should be changed.
One of the other questions is the impact of popular culture on all of this and the way in which so much of it today is almost self-reinforcing.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. As we see in popular culture and in a lot of pop music, pretty vulgar lyrics about women. Not to single out any pop musicians, but there are songs out there that very crudely depict rape and assault as if this is kind of a normative thing to do or something that a manly man should do. And, we see also in popular culture, while there's still strong male heroes, and it's great that we have strong female heroes, in a lot of movies and TV, men are kind of the butt of jokes, are depicted as bumbling and, kind of the Kramer-like guy from Seinfeld. And in a way that, it would be pretty politically incorrect to portray women. And there are a lot of things in popular culture too. Women singing songs about how we don't need men. So, yeah, I think it's had a huge influence, and the change in standards of what can be in the movies, on TV. Not to sound like a prude, but having more and more scenes of sex where men are, essentially the aggressors. Not always, but all too often the aggressors. Don't think helps much at all.
In a way, we're paying the price for 1,000+ years of patriarchy, I suppose.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's right. I like to point out that, on the average, women in America and throughout the world still have it worse, still get the short end of the stick when it comes to pay, to rights, etc. But, the fact that, women do still have it worse or discriminated against doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at other populations, i.e. these men out who are also struggling and suffering. I like to compare it to, there is a lot of poverty, dire poverty in a place like Bangladesh, but that doesn't mean we should ignore the poverty in the U.S.
Andrew Yarrow, his book is Man Out, Men on the Sidelines of American Life, just out from Brookings Press. Andrew, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's really been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you.